In this video, we're going to learn something called matching, and this is one of the most important techniques you'll learn when it comes to exposure blending. Essentially, when we've blended exposures, we'll sometimes find that the final blend looks really flat, and occasionally, when it's really bad, it'll look like a negative. But I'm going to show you how to fix that. Now, if you remember in the second video, I showed you these images and we talked about how we need to choose the correct exposure when exposure blending. So for example, this darker exposure was too dark to get a natural result. This exposure was much better because it blended smoothly with this base exposure. Now, if you missed that video, please go back because that's a really important step in exposure blending. We must know how to choose the correct raw files, otherwise we'll struggle to get a good final result. Now, I'm going to show you, sometimes we do have situations where we have to choose a really dark exposure. For whatever reason, occasionally it does happen. And there are other examples when we're shooting scenes of really high contrast where we have no choice at all but to work with exposures that are too far apart in terms of stops of light. And this is where matching comes in. So let's say we only have these two exposures to work with. Now, as always, I'm just going to select these exposures and go to Lens, Corrections, and remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Then I'm going to hold down Shift, and you see where it says Open Objects down there? I'm going to click on that. So please take these raw files from your download and load them into Photoshop just as I've done. Now I'm going to make this darker exposure invisible and I'm going to open Lumi 32. In fact, let's paint our selection into the darker exposure. So I'm going to make the darker exposure visible, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and left click on the Add a Layer Mask icon. Then I'm going to choose, let's say a bright swan. We want a fairly open scene and let's cycle through the channels to see if we can get a better selection. I'm looking for a completely white sky. So red didn't work. Green's a little bit better. Blue is great. So we want to bring our range down so that we're not affecting the foreground because that's too selected in the mask. And we want to add contrast to that mask so we can bring smoothness up. You see, each time we are crafting a more precise mask. Then when we're done, I'll choose Select the mask, Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. Select my brush with a white brush and I'll make it a big brush at 100% opacity. And then I can blend in that darker exposure. And of course, it doesn't look very good. And we can do it in the water too. So when I've done that, I press Control and D or Command and D. Now it goes without saying that the darker exposure is far too dark for this blend. It's killed the contrast in the scene completely and doesn't look natural at all. So one way to fix that, as you've seen a few times now, is by reducing the opacity of that darker exposure. But as we do that, look at how much beautiful detail we're losing from the sky. We've gone from a really moody sky to something which is a lot flatter. Another way to fix that is by creating a curves layer, clipping it to that darker exposure and bringing up the brightness of the curves layer. You see, and that starts to create a more natural final result. But that isn't the best way to do this. The best way to fix this type of blend is to choose your darker exposure, double click on the thumbnail of it, and that will open up Adobe Camera Raw. And now we just have to brighten up the darker exposure. That's all we need to do. So if I bring up the exposure a little bit, bring down the highlights quite a lot because we don't want that to be overexposed. We can keep making these adjustments and don't worry if you think we're going to add noise or image degradation because in reality, we're going to be using the best parts of this darker exposure, so the brighter parts. We're not going to be using the shadows or the darker elements in the foreground, which are more likely to accrue noise and other degradation. So in our final result, it should be fine. You're going to bring the shadows up a tiny bit. And we're brightening up this darker exposure throughout. So not just the brighter tones, but the darker tones too. So we're essentially matching the brightness levels of the darker exposure with the base exposure. And there's the final result. I think you can agree that that's a huge improvement on the previous version. And we've managed to keep all that beautiful mood in the sky, and we haven't had to bring down the opacity. Look at how perfect that blend is. So that's the process of matching. And of course, the more extreme we have to match exposures, the more chance there might be of image degradation, like white edging around things. Unfortunately, that's a sacrifice we have to make when we're shooting really extreme scenes of contrast. But the vast majority of times, the final result's really clean. If you look at my portfolio online on shutterrevolve.com, I use matching all the time, and you can see my images come out extremely clean. However, if you can, like in scenes like this, if you can choose a brighter exposure to blend into your base exposure instead of one that's really dark where you have to match, that would always be the better option. And that way you'll avoid image degradation completely. Now I'm going to show you this on a few more examples, and all of those are going to be on interior shots. And the reason why I'm choosing interiors is not because this is applicable mainly for interior shots. I'm choosing interiors because generally those are the scenes with the most amount of contrast. So if it can work with interiors, it can work with anything. Now, before we move on to those interior shots, I just want to show you one quick thing. If you are working with an exposure and you do see some image degradation, so I might be wrong, but I think the horizon here looks like it's got a bit of a light glow. It might not be, it might just be because the sun's in that direction. But let's say you do see some light edging around here. A decent way to deal with that is go back into your Adobe Camera Raw darker exposure. And here we're going to find a compromise. So previously when we've worked with darker exposures, if the effect's too strong in blending, we reduce the opacity of that exposure. But here we haven't done that at all. We've bypassed the reducing of the opacity and we've just affected changes in Adobe Camera Raw. But we can meet in the middle. In effect, we can still make changes to the raw files. So I'm just going to be a little bit less extreme. So let's say put highlights at about -50. So we can still make some changes, subtle changes, which will affect the final result, but it's less extreme. And then I can press OK. And of course, the blend looks a little bit strong, but I think there's less of a glow there on the horizon. And then we can bring down the opacity just as we've done previously. And you see, we're still keeping those dramatic clouds. We don't want to bring it down too much, but just enough so that the clouds look natural and we lose whatever image degradation we might see in the final image. So I think there's less glow on the horizon there. And as I say, that might be a natural glow, I've got no idea. But certainly zoomed in at 100%, it's completely invisible, so it doesn't really matter. But that is a good tip. You don't always have to be extreme in how you adjust the brightness values of the darker exposure. You can find a happy medium between that and opacity. So let's move on to the next image files. So here we have my go-to example when it comes to matching. I've used these sets of images before, and there's such a good example of how this works because this is such an extreme scene. Now, you'll see on the base we have a brighter exposure, and above we have a darker exposure. I'm going to select both of those exposures and do what we always do. Remove chromatic aberrations, enable profile corrections. And I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to hold down Shift, and you see we open objects, and then I'm going to stack them in Photoshop. With those exposures stacked in Photoshop, we have our base exposure on the bottom and our darker exposure on top. And I'm going to create a black mask on the darker exposure, so I'll hold Alt or Option on a Mac, left click on the mask icon, open Lumi 32, and I want to target the windows here, but you'll see it's going to be a little bit more challenging. We'll probably also include some of the walls as well, but that's okay. So let's say a Brights 3. And that's actually given us a pretty good selection. What I'm looking primarily at, apart from the walls, is this building here in the window. It's completely white, which is exactly what I wanted. So just to make sure that it's a little bit whiter, because I can see some gray areas in the building. I bring up my amplification. Then I can press Select. Select the mask. And with a white brush, press Ctrl and H or Command and H to hide the marching ants. And I'm going to paint in the window. I'll also paint a little bit in the floor here. So with that done, I'll press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection. Now that, I think we can agree, is a terrible final result. If I bring down the opacity of that brighter exposure, it doesn't really help because it makes the outside, the exterior, invisible. So let's see what matching can do here. I'm going to double click on the thumbnail of the darker exposure. I'm going to bring up exposure and knock down highlights. So I'm going to keep brightening up this interior so that it looks closer to the base exposure. And in fact, I'm going to bring highlights all the way down. Now, it doesn't have to be super bright, but it does need to be bright enough so that we get rid of this horrible blend. And you see the difference that made? That's before and that's after. And if we zoom in, we can see it doesn't have any white edging around the window frames. So that's done a pretty good job. It still looks a bit unnatural. So another thing we can do is we can double click on the thumbnail of the brighter exposure. And you'll see, I think this brighter exposure is actually a little bit too bright. So we can bring down the exposure of that a tiny bit, bring down the highlights all the way, and then press OK. Now we have a slightly darker scene, but look how much more natural it looks. If I undo that, you see we have flattening area in the wall in the top left here. The floor still looks unnatural, but by darkening the brighter exposure, we kind of meet in the middle. Now the wall has its texture back and the foreground looks totally natural. Personally, I would actually mask out the floor at a lower opacity, let's say of around 30%, and a smaller brush, of course, just to brighten that area. And I press Command and D and Control and D just to make sure I haven't got any active selection going. And then, of course, you can start editing your image. And how you do that depends entirely on your specifications. So usually interiors, you probably want them relatively bright. Now you might have noticed that the sofa has become a little bit oversaturated. So in Lumi 32, we can press Saturation. And of course, that will pick the most saturated parts of the image. So definitely the sofa mainly. We'll bring range down because we only really want to affect the sofa, less of the outside. Let's keep bringing range all the way down. And to amplify that selection in the sofa, we can increase amplification. And then just go to a hue saturation layer. And we can bring down the saturation of that sofa. Now another way to do that in Photoshop, which is actually a little bit easier in this scene, is open up a hue saturation layer, select this hand, click on the red area of the sofa and bring down the saturation. And of course you can even bring up the brightness of that area or the darkness, whatever you want. So that's before and after blending. Naturally, this type of scene needs a lot more contrast, but if you're a real estate photographer, you'll know that that depends on your client's demands. So I'm going to leave you to run through your normal workflow once you've blended those images. Now let's move on to the next scene. Here we have 3 exposures. So we have a base exposure, a brighter exposure, and a darker exposure. So I'm going to select all 3 exposures and do my usual cleaning. Then I'm going to hold down Shift and open objects. And then of course I'm going to stack them. I'll put the base exposure on the bottom, the darker exposure in the middle, the brighter exposure on top. Now for the darker exposure, I want to bring back this area above the chandelier and right down here at the far end of the image. So with a black mask, I open Lumi 32 and I make a selection of those areas. So again, let's go for a bright 3, a more targeted selection. And I think that's done a pretty good job. If I press Select, Command and H or Control and H, choose the mask and a white brush set at 100% opacity and a big brush, I can paint in that area. And I can do the same here. And of course, Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection. And I think we can agree that doesn't look particularly good. So bringing down the opacity of that darker exposure actually does do a pretty good job. But just for good practice, let's show you a different technique that we can use, which will come in handy every now and then. If we double click on this darker thumbnail just as before, and we follow the exact same steps as we've done before. So bring up exposure, bring down the highlights. So we are matching or brightening up the darker exposure. And once we're happy, we can press OK. Now, every now and then when we do this, we'll notice there might be a slight contrast or color adjustment in the area we're blending. So I'm going to zoom in and show you this. Look around here. Since we've affected the raw file, that has changed the colors ever so slightly in this darker exposure. So it's made them a bit more saturated. There's before and after. And one way to fix that really easily is to change the blend mode of this layer to luminosity only. So there's before and there's after. You see, luminosity has kept the luminosity adjustments, but not the color adjustments. So there's the blend before and after. And I'd probably bring the opacity down of that exposure anyway, just a little bit. Now for the brighter exposure, I'm just going to create a general darks mask. So I'm going to keep the brighter exposure visible, because if we look at the base exposure, pretty much everything's dark in here. So it's going to select the walls as well. And we just want to select the chairs in the foreground mainly. And I think the brighter exposure is going to give us that selection because those areas are dark in the brighter exposure. So if I go for a general darks 1 mask, remember we're always trying to make darks 1 mask really white, a general white, kind of like this. So we can bring up the smoothness to give it more contrast and remove some of these walls. So I'm going to bring the range down a bit and maybe a tiny bit more. If I'm happy with that, I just press apply. And so there's the before and after. Now the problem with that is I think we have created a flat foreground here. You see we've got some gorgeous textures in the tiles, but with a brighter exposure blended in, it doesn't look so great. It looks a little bit too flat. So most of the time we can just reduce the opacity of the brighter exposure and that'll bring back those textures, but still keep some information in the darkest areas in our image. So for example, here in the chairs. But what if we don't want to do that? What if we want to keep opacity at 100%? Well, we can open up the brighter exposure like we've done with the darker exposure before, and we can darken the brighter exposure. So often we brighten up our darker exposure, we do the opposite with our bright exposure. And the point of that is we are matching the brightness levels of the darker exposure with the base exposure. So we're trying to make them look similar while keeping the information in the darkest areas. So these chairs here. We can also, if we want, bring up the clarity slider and that will increase local contrast. Watch what happens when I press OK. So remember the foreground was flat. Now it's got some contrast back. So this was before the adjustment and this is after that adjustment. And at the same time, we've managed to keep information in these seats here. So there's before and after. So to get a relatively smooth blend, we just needed to brighten up our darker exposure and to darken our brighter exposure. Just a little bit. And the great thing about that is the reason why it comes out with such a clean final result is that we're always taking the best areas from each of those exposures. So it's not the same as just bringing a slider down, bringing the highlight slider down in Lightroom, and bringing the shadow slider up in Lightroom on just one exposure. Instead, what we're doing is we're taking 3 exposures, we're taking the best area, so the brightest area and the darker exposure, the darkest area and the bright exposure, and we're putting them into the base exposure. So there should be far less image degradation than if we just had one file. So again, there's before and after. Here's another interior shot. Now guys, if you're shooting interiors, nothing will be better than if you've got the appropriate lighting available. Exposure blending can only do so much. The more stops of light you have apart between each exposures, the more difficult it's going to be. But using appropriate lighting will narrow those stops of light and make it a lot easier. Not to mention moodier and give you more control over your final result. So in this image, we have a base exposure, a darker exposure, and a really bright exposure. So I'm going to select all 3, clean them in Adobe Camera Raw, hold down Shift and open Objects. And with these 3 exposures stacked, I'm going to take the base exposure to the bottom, the brighter exposure at the top, and the darker exposure in the middle. So we're going to put the external shot, the trees here, into this exposure so that the window isn't overexposed. And to do that, I'm going to create a black mask on the darker exposure. Sorry, that's the brighter exposure. Make the darker exposure visible. Open Lumi 32 and go for another really contrasting mask. And that's pretty easy selection since the windows are so overexposed. Then I choose Select, Command and H or Control and H. And I want to avoid the bed and things like that because obviously it's going to be too dark if I do that. So I'm just going to choose the window. There we go, I can blend that in. and do this window here and that window there. We don't need to do anything else. If we did the bed, you'd see it would go pretty much black. Then I press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection. Now we've got a lot of work to do here because you can see how unnatural that blend is. The window panes are black, as are the frames and the curtains. And in fact, the window's a little bit overexposed as well. So let's open Adobe Camera Raw on this darker exposure and bring down the highlights quite a bit. Then I'm going to bring up my exposure. Now, by the way, I'm working with a mid-range camera here, a Canon, which was relatively inexpensive. So if we can do this with the raw files of that Canon camera, I'm sure you can do it with better raw files from more up-range cameras. So I've set exposure to plus 2.3, highlights to minus 70, and shadows to plus 3.3. And you see we've brightened our image now, and we've brought back some of the information in the trees in the window. Now we don't want to bring it back too much because it'll look unnatural. There's only so far we can bring it anyway. So if we're happy with that, we press OK. And watch this transformation. So there's before and after. Now in my opinion, the window frame still looks a little bit unnatural, so we could bring down the opacity of that darker exposure because we only need some trees in there. We don't need it to be super dark or bright. Or, so let's say I put the opacity at around 80%. Or we can open up the dark exposure Adobe Camera Raw again and brighten the interior even more. Bring down the highlights a tiny bit more. And press OK. And there the tree looks a lot more natural. So there's before and there's after, and so does the window frame here as well. So this is before exposure blending and after, and I think that looks pretty good. Now with the brighter exposure, again, we are going to try and build a mask just targeting the shadows, but it might be a little bit too bright for that. Let's try it. Here's a darks one. Yeah, so if we build a darks one, look, we only have a few areas selected. So I'm going to cancel that, and that's because our bright exposure is so bright we don't have many darker tones in there. Look at our base exposure. Essentially, we want to brighten up the entirety of this room. We're not targeting just one little area here or one little area by the bed. We're trying to brighten up everything. So we need to create a mask which basically targets the whole interior minus the bed. So I'm going to build the mask around the base exposure. So that means the dark exposure is invisible too. Selecting darks 1, so it's a really general mask. That looks okay, but I think we need to make it much brighter. Let's put amplification all the way up. I think that's done a pretty good job. It's selected the vast majority of tones in the image. So if we just press apply, you'll see we've blended our exposures, but look how unnatural it looks. And that's because the brighter exposure is far too bright for this scene. We can bring down the opacity of that brighter exposure, and that will do a good job of making a more natural final result. So there's before and after. Or we can leave our opacity at 100% and instead do what we did in the previous image. We can darken the brighter exposure, and often when we do this, we'll keep most of our beautiful textures. Just bring up the shadows a little bit. Like for example, the stone in the wall here. If we're happy with that, we can press OK. And if it's still a little bit too bright, we just bring down the opacity of that brighter exposure. So let's keep going until it looks relatively natural. I'm going to bring this down a lot more. I think that'll pretty much do it. But I think that has affected the blend in the window here just a little bit. I mean, the vast majority of people wouldn't notice it, but I notice it, so I'm going to change it. I've selected the mask from the brighter exposure, a black brush, and with an opacity of about 30%, I'm going to run my brush down this window frame. I think that's a lot better. So this is before exposure blending, and that's after, before and after. And I think we can say with relative certainty that we couldn't have pulled that much information back in the single raw file. So here is the base exposure. There's the highlights all the way down. And there's exposure up. And you see we're just not going to get that same level of detail. And of course, we're going to get a lot more noise by cranking the sliders there. whereas in our final result, we won't get anywhere near that level of noise. In fact, it's more or less noise-free. So here's our final example. Again, it's an interior and a particularly difficult image to shoot because our raw files are really far apart in terms of brightness. So this is our base exposure, this is our brighter exposure. I'm going to select both of them and I'm going to clean them as usual. So I've got remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections selected. Then I hold down Shift and open as objects. So we've got a brighter exposure on the bottom, darker exposure on top. In this blend, we're going to paint in, so we create a black mask on the darker exposure. We open Lumi 32 and let's go for a bright 1 first and see if that's okay. Right, I think that's far too bright. We just want to select the external parts of the image and I think that looks pretty good. Let's amplify the selection, bring down the range so we're trying to target the external part of the scene more. And if that looks okay, press select, Command and H to hide the marching ants, choose the mask with a white brush at 100% opacity with not too big a brush because we want to keep the paint within the selected areas. And I'm going to paint in this outside area. And let's do a little bit of the interior so you can see how I'm going to manually paint that out. And let me paint over this area a little bit more. I want to make sure all the tree from the darker exposure comes through because there's movement between the brighter exposure and the darker exposure with those branches. So we can only use one exposure for that area. So if I keep going over with this blend, we'll just be using the darker exposure. And I'm going to paint in this window here too. And let me paint once over this skylight. So yeah, that looks pretty bad. I think we can all agree. And to fix it, we'll open up Adobe Camera Raw on the darker exposure. We'll bring up exposure, let's say by 2 stops. Bring highlights down. We want to recover as much of the highlights as possible, but not too much, because it has to look natural. One of the things with exposure blending that we have to learn, and which comes with time, is understanding the balance of light within a scene. So sometimes when I see real estate shots that are poorly shot, the exterior is darker than the interior when it's the middle of the day and sunny outside. So it doesn't really make sense. The exterior should look brighter than the interior, especially on a day like today. So with that done, let's bring up the shadows a little bit as well. I'm going to press OK. And look at how much of a difference that makes. It's much smoother, much better. So there's before and after. Now if I want, I can open up my brighter exposure and bring down the highlights, because often that creates a smooth blend between those exposures when there's a big range of light between the two. So for example, in the floor, it's going to make a subtle difference. So here's before and here's after. You see, before we had a little bit of lack of contrast in the floor where we blended the darker exposure, and here's after, and it looks a little bit better. Not a massive difference, but often in other images that will make a big difference. So I'm selecting the darker exposure mask and I've got a black paintbrush and I'm going to set the opacity at 30%, and I'm actually going to paint out the blending in the floor because I think it's taken away too much texture. So there we are. We press Command and D or Control and D and zoom in and look at this exterior. So you can see it looks pretty good. We've recovered what we needed to recover. And with that, we can start editing. Now, one of the benefits of luminosity mask exposure blending ahead of, let's say, blend if exposure blending is that we can create, let's say, a levels adjustment layer and put it underneath the darker exposure. So we can change the brightness of our interior because our interior belongs on just the brighter exposure for the most part. So if we want to create a brighter interior, we can do that by bringing up the slider. And if we want, we can create a levels layer on our darker exposure, press this clipping icon, and we can even darken or brighten our exterior. So depending on your client's needs and your particular style, you would continue on your interior workflow. Now, like I said before at the beginning of this video, matching is not limited to interior photography. It's essential in so many different areas, including landscapes and cityscapes. The reason why I've shown you these interior shots is because they're notoriously difficult to blend. So if you can blend these, you can pretty much blend anything.